is actually taking place. I know many of the folks in this room, we've had conferences, unofficial ones like this, around many different dining room tables and boardrooms, but unofficially. But to see this happening is quite remarkable, and I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to share what I think are some very interesting results with you as it relates to the one community that I don't think anyone in this room would argue probably is the most impacted, if not the most interested in, the new developments. Let's start first just by quickly going through the methodology. This is a survey that was conducted over the course of the last week or so. March 20th through 25th was our final night in the field, and it was done with 400 Cuban American adults living in the United States. There are approximately 2 million Cuban Americans living in the United States. Believe it or not, we're now in all 50 states. It's not just Miami-Dade County or southern Florida, and this poll was designed to be representative so as to give the most complete perspective of the Cuban American community as a whole. The margin of error is plus or minus 4.9 percentage points. And I think, folks, for those who doubt the power of words, I want to just quickly show you how 26 seconds changed a 50-year stalemate, which led to this conference and candidly to these poll results.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
So it was in the aftermath of that historic speech on December 17th that led us to do this poll, two polls that were conducted, one in the immediate aftermath and the one that you're about to see here. This was in essence what was shared with the survey respondents, a summary of the President's announcements. On the 17th of December, President Obama announced that the United States would begin to normalize relations with Cuba for the first time since 1961. Normalizing relations with Cuba would mean the reestablishment of an embassy, carrying out high-level exchanges and visits between the two governments, working with Cuba on issues like trafficking, environmental protection, human trafficking, etc., greater banking ties, raising the level of remittances allowed to be sent to Cuban nationals, and allowing American travelers to import goods from Cuba. This is the policy as laid out by the White House in the United States government. When asking the Cuban American community their response, do they approve or disapprove? The results are 51%. We now have a slight majority of the Cuban American community nationally supports the new policy. So it goes without saying, this is a tremendously interesting finding because I think it challenges some of the conventional wisdom that many have talked about as it relates to the Cuban American community's response to this new policy. What I think is also very revelatory is the story within the story, the breaks, if you will. What used to be a very monolithic community when it came to seeing certain issues, particularly around U.S.-Cuba policy, as recently as 10 years ago, we're now seeing the emergence of two Cuban-American communities, as outlined here. Those U.S.-born Cuban-Americans, I know there are many in this room, 2/3 support the new policy. But even those in Cuba, born in Cuba, you have split support for the new policy. When you look at those Cuban-born Cubans that have come after the 1980s to the United States, a majority, 56%, support the policy. You see a contrast, though, with those Cuban-American exiles who came and arrived before the 1980s period. Of course, these are the exilio históricos. So you see a difference between the Cuban-born population and how they view this issue depending on decade of arrival. The same principle applies to age, a tremendous generational gap here. Those, in essence, under the age of 50 see and support the policy by at least 60 to 69%. Even a plurality or a split of those 50 to 64. It is only amongst those 65 plus that not overwhelmingly, but a majority still, admittedly, oppose the new policy. And then when you look at by area of residence or state of residence, for those of us that spend time in Miami-Dade County, we know the chilling effect that it has a lot of times and how Miami-Dade County is almost a world in and of itself when it comes to this issue. And we see even within the Cuban-American community, if you're outside of Florida, but primarily Miami-Dade County, you're much more likely to be supportive of the new policy than you are if you still live in Miami-Dade County. Many of them have, believe me, asserted themselves just in the last couple of hours since the poll was released to let me know that, yes, they are of the 41% or the 49% that disagrees with the new policy. And then I think here's the more remarkable difference. When you look at this poll and this question, which was asked in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, the very night of the announcement, in fact, we were able to get in the field that night with a poll, versus asking it last week, you see a 15-point swing overall. What at first was a split result with, in essence, more people opposing the new policy than supporting it is now 51 in favor, 40 against, 9 either didn't have an opinion or didn't answer the question. So significant change. Now, let's get into the other two major policy consideration points. Oh, I just saw a friend of mine in the audience there. When it comes to the easing of travel restrictions, here you see even greater majority support now amongst the Cuban American community for doing away with the travel restrictions as it relates to the United States and traveling to Cuba. 56% of favor easing the travel restrictions as opposed to 35% that oppose. Again, a tremendous divide whether you were born in Cuba as opposed to born in the United States. 69% of U.S.-born Cuban Americans want to do away with the travel restrictions, but even a majority, slight majority, of those born in Cuba feel the same way. And then that's even more dramatic amongst those born in Cuba depending on their decade of arrival. Those that came after Mariel, 58% support easing travel. Those that came before, a plurality, almost a majority, are still in opposition. And of course, the same phenomena we saw earlier play out depending on where the Cuban Americans live, whether it's in Florida or outside of Florida. Here also, I think, gives evidence to the shift that we've seen just in the last 3 months since the announcement took place. Before, there was still not majority support for the easing of travel restrictions in the immediate aftermath of the President's announcement. Now those numbers have moved by a similar 15-point swing from December 2014 to the present day. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to they themselves, the Cuban American community, wanting to travel. Overall, 67% say they don't have any travel plans to Cuba in the immediate future. However, when again you break it down and look at the subgroup analysis, there's a distinction between who is interested in going and who is not in the near future, and that's U.S.-born Cuban Americans, and within that subgroup, it's mostly young Cuban Americans, those between the ages of 18 and 29. I think we didn't follow up or ask, but I think common sense and anecdotal evidence would suggest that that's primarily because there is a pent-up curiosity, a pent-up interest in wanting to explore the country of many of their parents and even grandparents that they probably have never been to. So I think that's where, for those of you tourist brokers or folks that have an interest in tourism travel, this is a group that has an immediate interest in the short term. And then, of course, the embargo is the other major policy point. Here you see not quite a majority support as we saw for the new policy of normalization, the greater majority for the easing of travel restrictions. When it comes to the embargo, a plurality, yes, want to end the embargo, 47%, whereas 36% maintain that the embargo should continue. And just like we saw before, the pattern holds as well. Significant breaks depending on if you were born in the United States, where 60% of those U.S.-born Cuban Americans say end the embargo, as opposed to those born in Cuba, where you could say it's a technical split, but for purposes of the numbers here, 2 percentage points more favor ending it than favor continuing it, 43 to 41. And also, of course, by decade of arrival, those that came to the United States before the Mariel boat lift and prior to that, a majority want to continue the embargo. Those that came after Mariel, a plurality want to end the embargo. Same points here as we see by age. And then again, also, here is the shift that we saw just in the last 3 months on the embargo. You see another sign that the community is evolving, if you will, depending on your viewpoint on this issue, for support, because you see, again, movement in favor of ending the embargo just in the 3-month interval since the President's announcement. This brings us to the, I think, other fascinating aspect of this poll and the centerpiece of the discussion here around the conference, and that, of course, is the economic opportunity within Cuba, many of which folks in this room are keenly interested. And what is interesting is that the Cuban American community has even less resistance to the economic opportunity. There's greater majority support for understanding of what's that about. Here we're actually going to share with you questions that have been asked for the first time. These are not comparison questions because we didn't ask this in the immediate aftermath of when the policy was announced. So let's go to the first one. Do you think that companies owned by Cuban Americans in the United States should be able to sell their products in Cuba? 58% answer in the affirmative. Yes, if you're a Cuban American and you own a company, you should be able to sell your products in Cuba. And this has virtually unanimous support. Even those 65 plus, not quite a majority, but a plurality of those support this as well. Next question. The U.S. government recently made regulatory changes to authorize for certain goods and services produced by independent Cuban entrepreneurs to be imported into the United States. Do you think that independent businesses opened and operated by Cubans living in Cuba, this is Cubans living in Cuba, should be able to sell their products in the United States? A similar majority, in this case 56%, answer in the affirmative. Now, do you think Cubans living in the United States should be able to provide funding to help their friends and family members living in Cuba open and operate their own businesses? 66% answer in the affirmative. Now, many of you here, I would presume, are Cuba watchers. These, even for me, who's been studying this issue for over 25 years, shocking figures, the fact that this percentage, this high percentage of the Cuban American community is in favor of this type of capital exchange taking place within the island. And here you see, I thought this was a dramatic slide. Those Cubans that were born in Cuba that have come to the United States after the 1980s overwhelmingly say, yes, this can be done. And I think the takeaway there, without wanting to read too much, is these are the folks that have the more visceral ties to the island. In many respects, they have family, immediate family, friends and relationships that are still living on the island. They know the impact of what's happening. And again, generationally as well, this is one of those findings that the entire community, a majority, support this perspective and point of view. Do you think any individual or company in the United States, now we're taking away the Cuban American permission slip, if you will, and now just saying any American, individual or business, should be able to provide funding to Cubans living in Cuba to open and operate their own business? Here again, a majority say yes. 55% are in favor of this position as it relates strictly to American business and American individuals, not necessarily of Cuban American descent or origin. Fascinating question. Currently, United States companies like Coca-Cola, Nike, and Apple sell their products in communist countries like China and Vietnam. Do you think that U.S. companies should be able to sell their products in Cuba? An even higher percentage, 62%, answer in the affirmative. And I remind you, this is not a poll of all Americans. This is a poll of Cuban Americans. So keep in mind what this means in terms of the community of the present and the community of the future. These findings would not have held, and Congressman Garcia will be the first to tell you, if we asked these questions as recently probably as 5 years ago. So you've seen a quantum shift in public opinion within the Cuban American space and sphere on this very issue. This is another fascinating, I know we just had Frank up here on the panel. Do you think passenger cruise lines, such as Carnival and Royal Caribbean, should be allowed to take passengers between the United States and Cuba? Now, there are many folks, and I think have legitimate grievances, that say that there should be no recreational tourism to Cuba, that is just empowering a tyrannical regime, and to the extent that travel should happen, it should be purposeful travel. But here, you see the Cuban American community saying, well, you know what, as it relates to the cruise industry, which we know is mostly for pleasure and recreational travel, a majority in this case support it. And again, look at the generational acceptance of this. It's obviously much higher the younger you are. But even those 65 plus are split within the margin of error as it relates to this issue. So again, just fascinating insights, I think, from my perspective, in a community that is quickly changing. All of us are being impacted by this. And if there are any questions that you have as it relates to the polling material or anything else, I'd be happy to entertain and take any of those. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, excellent presentation and very fresh. I'm impressed that you guys got 2 polls in, and the comparison was very enlightening. I'm wondering how this, in your opinion as a pollster, how this relates to elections, to political voting versus giving an opinion in a poll, because I had my money in support behind our friend Joe Garcia to be reelected, and unfortunately he wasn't. And every election is about a lot of different issues, but the people who support the former policy say, well, the only poll that matters is the election, right? And so how do you think this, if it does translate to behavior at voting booths versus a poll? Thank you.
Fascinating question with many implications for the future. What I can tell you is that to understand the political dynamic, one must understand the changing demographic of the Cuban American electorate. Now, we're no longer talking about the Cuban American community, but rather the Cuban American electorate. And one of the things that's happening there that we've documented and seen, not just in our survey, but in other studies as well, is that as you have the older historic exiles that we saw represented in a sense here, as they leave the electorate or as they are counterbalanced by younger Cuban Americans and those that have recently arrived and entered the electorate, there has been a moderating impact in terms of how they view U.S.-Cuba policy. Now, I challenge the notion that there has been an election in the last 2 or 3 cycles where Cuban Americans have been voting only on the basis of Cuba policy. Not to suggest it's not an issue that they care about, not to suggest it's not an issue that is important, but according to exit polls that we've done, when you ask to rate the degree of importance of issues amongst Cuban American voters, U.S.-Cuba policy doesn't even crack the top 10. Having said that, if you were to have conducted this poll with the 6 members of the Cuban American delegation in Congress, it would be 100-0 against normalization. Yes, sir.
So what about the first poll, the December poll, was December 14th before Obama spoke or was after Obama spoke?
The night or the day of the announcement, I was en route to start a family vacation. I immediately U-turned my car, went to the side of the road, and started drafting the poll. We went into the field that very night and reported it 2 days later. So it was a flash poll that was done in the immediate aftermath, of course, of the president's announcement because we thought it was important to see what the Cuban American community's reaction would be. And that was something that the Miami Herald and the Tampa Bay Times and the El Nuevo Herald sponsored as well. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think they're really on a tight time. I'm happy to hang out in the lunch session if there's any individual questions. With that, I want to welcome back Mr. Diaz-Calera to the stage.